Sarah Martinez had always been different from the other girls in her small Texas town. While her classmates spent their afternoons at the mall or gossiping about boys, Sarah could be found at the local military surplus store, studying maps and reading accounts of famous battles. Her bedroom walls were covered not with posters of pop stars, but with photographs of military aircraft, ships, and the proud faces of service members who had given everything for their country. Her fascination with the military began when she was just 7 years old. Her grandfather, a World War II veteran who had stormed the beaches of Normandy, would sit with her on the front porch swing every evening, telling stories of courage, sacrifice, and brotherhood that existed among those who served. His weathered hands would trace the faded tattoos on his forearms as he spoke of fallen comrades and the weight of carrying their memory. "Service isn't about glory, mija," he would say in his gentle voice, using the Spanish endearment that made her feel special. "It's about standing up when others can't. It's about being willing to give everything so others can be free." Those words planted a seed that would grow stronger with each passing year. When her grandfather passed away during her sophomore year of high school, Sarah found his old military trunk in the attic. Inside were medals, photographs, letters from fellow soldiers, and a small leather-bound journal filled with his thoughts about duty and honor. Reading those pages, she knew with absolute certainty what path her life would take. But convincing others of her determination proved to be an uphill battle. Her mother, Elena, was a traditional woman who believed strongly that her daughter should focus on finding a good husband and starting a family. The idea of Sarah joining the military filled her with dread and disappointment. "You're throwing your life away," Elena would argue during their frequent confrontations. "The military is no place for a woman, especially not my daughter. You could be a teacher, a nurse, something respectable and safe." Her father, Miguel, was more supportive but cautious. He had served briefly in the army during peacetime and understood the calling Sarah felt, but he worried about the challenges she would face as a woman in what was still largely a man's world. "If this is truly what you want," he told her one evening as they worked together in his auto repair shop, "then you need to be prepared for people to doubt you every step of the way. You'll have to prove yourself twice as hard as any man, and even then, some people will never see you as an equal." Sarah's determination only grew stronger in the face of doubt. She began training immediately, running 5 miles every morning before school, doing push-ups and sit-ups until her muscles screamed in protest, and studying military strategy and history with the intensity of a scholar preparing for doctoral exams. Her classmates found her obsession amusing at first, then increasingly annoying as she refused to be swayed from her path. They called her G.I. Jane mockingly, made jokes about her boyish clothes and lack of interest in makeup or dating. The popular girls would whisper and giggle when she walked by, making comments loud enough for her to hear about how she was trying too hard to be a man. The mockery reached its peak during her senior year, when Sarah made a decision that would follow her for years to come. On her 18th birthday, against her parents' wishes and despite the protests of nearly everyone who knew her, she walked into a tattoo parlor in the next town over and had something very special inked onto her shoulder. The tattoo was a detailed recreation of the Navy SEAL trident, the golden eagle clutching an anchor, trident and flintlock pistol that represented everything she aspired to become. Below it, in elegant script, were the words, "The only easy day was yesterday," the unofficial motto of the SEALs. When she returned home that evening and showed her parents what she had done, the reaction was explosive. Her mother cried, her father shook his head in disappointment, and her younger brother Carlos looked at her as if she had lost her mind. "You can't even join the SEALs!" Carlos shouted, his 15-year-old voice cracking with emotion. "They don't let girls in. You got a tattoo for something you can never be." The words stung because they were true. In 2003, women were not allowed to serve in direct combat roles, and elite special operations units, like the Navy SEALs, remained exclusively male. But Sarah's tattoo wasn't about what she could become. It was about what she believed in, what she would strive toward, and the standards she would hold herself to, regardless of the barriers in her way. At school, the tattoo became a source of constant ridicule. Students would ask to see it just so they could laugh and point out how stupid it was to get a tattoo for something she could never achieve. Teachers would shake their heads in disappointment when they caught glimpses of it during gym class or when she wore sleeveless shirts. "That's the dumbest thing I've ever seen," sneered Jessica Morrison, the head cheerleader who had made Sarah's life miserable for years. "You might as well have tattooed delusional on your forehead." The boys were even worse, seeing her military aspirations as a personal challenge to their masculinity. They would make crude jokes about what basic training would do to her body, question whether she was really a girl at all, and constantly remind her that she would never be strong enough, fast enough, or tough enough to serve alongside real soldiers. But perhaps the cruelest comments came from adults who should have known better. Her guidance counselor, Mrs. Patterson, called her into the office after hearing about the tattoo and spent an hour trying to convince her to consider more realistic career options. "I understand you want to serve your country," Mrs. Patterson said with condescending sympathy, "but there are many ways to do that without putting yourself in harm's way. Have you considered military intelligence? Or perhaps working for the State Department?" Even some of the teachers who had known her grandfather and respected his service seemed to think her goals were misguided. Mr. Thompson, her history teacher, who was himself a Vietnam veteran, pulled her aside after class one day to express his concerns. "Your grandfather was a good man and a brave soldier," he said quietly, "but this isn't his war anymore. The military today is different, more dangerous, and it's still not ready for women like you who want to be in the thick of things." The constant barrage of doubt and ridicule might have broken a weaker person, but it only served to fuel Sarah's determination. Every snide comment, every dismissive laugh, every person who told her she was dreaming impossible dreams became additional motivation for her to prove them wrong. She began keeping a journal, writing down every slight and every person who had doubted her abilities, not out of spite or revenge, but as a reminder of what she was fighting against. She knew that someday, when she had achieved everything they said was impossible, she would look back at those pages and remember how far she had come. Her training intensified as graduation approached. She was running 10 miles a day now, had built a makeshift obstacle course in the woods behind her house, and was studying everything she could get her hands on about military tactics, weapon systems, and leadership principles. Her grades remained excellent, despite the time devoted to physical preparation, and she had already been accepted to several colleges with ROTC programs. But the social isolation was taking its toll. Most of her former friends had drifted away, unable to understand or support her unconventional dreams. She spent most of her free time alone, training or studying, becoming more and more focused on her goals but increasingly cut off from her peers. The worst incident came just 2 weeks before graduation. Sarah was at the local diner where many students gathered after school when she overheard a conversation at the next table that made her blood boil. 3 boys from her class were making crude jokes about her tattoo and speculating about what would happen to her in the military. "I heard they break down girls like her real quick in boot camp," one of them said loudly enough for her to hear. "She'll probably cry and quit the first time someone yells at her, if she even makes it that far," another added. "I bet she washes out in the first week. All this tough girl act is just for show." The third boy, Tommy Rodriguez, who had asked her to prom 2 years earlier and been politely declined, was the cruelest of all. "She's just trying to get attention. Girls like her, who think they're better than everyone else, they always crash and burn eventually. That stupid tattoo is going to look pretty ridiculous when she's working at the grocery store in 5 years." Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had learned that reacting to their taunts only gave them more ammunition to use against her. Instead, she quietly finished her meal, paid her check, and walked out of the diner with her head held high. But the words followed her home and echoed in her mind as she lay in bed that night. For the first time since getting the tattoo, she found herself wondering if maybe everyone was right. Maybe she was chasing an impossible dream. Maybe the barriers facing women in the military were too high to overcome. Maybe she should listen to her mother and choose a safer, more traditional path. The doubt lasted exactly one night. The next morning, she woke before dawn and went for her usual run. But instead of her normal route through town, she drove to the cemetery where her grandfather was buried. As the sun rose over the horizon, she stood before his headstone and spoke to him as if he were still alive. "They all think I'm crazy, abuelo," she whispered, using the Spanish word for grandfather that she had called him as a child. "They think I'm trying to be something I can never be. Maybe they're right. Maybe I should just give up and be what everyone expects me to be." The morning breeze rustled through the oak trees that shaded the cemetery, and Sarah could almost hear her grandfather's voice in response. She remembered his stories about facing down Nazi machine gun nests, about carrying wounded comrades to safety, about making choices that meant the difference between life and death for people he had never met. He had never taken the easy path, never let others define what he was capable of achieving, and neither would she. Standing there in the growing daylight, with her grandfather's words echoing in her memory, Sarah made a promise that would guide the rest of her life. No matter how many people doubted her, no matter how many obstacles were placed in her path, no matter how impossible her dreams seemed to others, she would never stop fighting to prove them wrong. The tattoo on her shoulder was more than just ink and skin. It was a declaration of war against anyone who would try to limit her potential, a permanent reminder of the standards she would hold herself to, and a promise to her grandfather that she would carry on his legacy of service and sacrifice. As she walked back to her car that morning, Sarah felt a sense of peace and determination that she had never experienced before. Let them mock her dreams. Let them tell her what she could and couldn't achieve. She would show them all exactly what she was made of. The final weeks of high school passed in a blur of graduation preparations, college planning, and increasingly intense physical training. Sarah had decided to attend Texas A&M University and join their Corps of Cadets program, seeing it as the first step on her path to military service. On graduation night, as she sat among her classmates listening to speeches about following dreams and making a difference in the world, Sarah touched the tattoo hidden beneath her cap and gown. In just a few months, she would begin the next phase of her journey, leaving behind the small-minded thinking of her hometown and entering a world where her determination and abilities would be tested in ways she couldn't yet imagine. She had no idea that 20 years later, in a moment that would validate every sacrifice and prove wrong every doubter, a Navy SEAL commander would look at that same tattoo and recognize something that few others had ever seen, the heart of a true warrior, regardless of gender. But that moment was still far in the future. For now, Sarah Martinez was just an 18-year-old girl with impossible dreams and the unshakable conviction that she could achieve anything she set her mind to, no matter who tried to stand in her way. College Station, Texas felt like stepping into an entirely different world when Sarah arrived at Texas A&M University in the fall of 2003. The sprawling campus with its red brick buildings and military precision was both intimidating and exhilarating. As she unpacked her belongings in her dormitory room, she could hear the sound of marching feet and shouted commands drifting across the quadrangle from the Corps of Cadets training areas. The Corps of Cadets at Texas A&M was one of the largest military training programs in the country, with a proud tradition dating back to 1876. For Sarah, it represented the first real step toward proving that her dreams weren't just the fantasies of a small-town girl with unrealistic expectations. Here, she would be measured not by the prejudices of her high school classmates, but by her ability to meet the same standards as everyone else. But the transition wasn't easy. The academic workload was intense, the physical demands were brutal, and the social dynamics were more complex than anything she had experienced before. As a freshman cadet, or fish in Corps terminology, Sarah was at the bottom of a strict hierarchy that demanded absolute obedience and flawless execution of even the smallest tasks. Her first few weeks were a nightmare of constant corrections, push-ups as punishment for minor infractions, and the grinding pressure of trying to memorize vast amounts of military knowledge while keeping up with her engineering coursework. The upperclassmen who served as her trainers were relentless in their pursuit of perfection, and they seemed to take special pleasure in pushing the female cadets to their breaking point. "Martinez!" Cadet Lieutenant Jake Morrison would bellow during morning formations. "Your uniform is a disgrace. Drop and give me 20. Sarah would immediately hit the ground and begin doing push-ups while Morrison continued his inspection of the other freshmen. The public humiliation was designed to break down individual ego and build unit cohesion, but for Sarah it felt like a continuation of the mockery she had endured in high school. The worst part wasn't the physical punishment or even the verbal abuse. It was the subtle message that she didn't belong. While the male freshmen were treated harshly, there seemed to be an underlying assumption that they would eventually prove themselves worthy of respect. With Sarah and the other female cadets, there was a sense that they were being tolerated rather than trained. that their presence was an unfortunate concession to political correctness rather than a valuable addition to the program. This attitude was most evident during combat training exercises, where the female cadets were often relegated to support roles while the men engaged in the more challenging and prestigious combat simulations. When Sarah protested and asked to participate in the full range of training activities, she was told that it was for her own safety and protection. "Look, Martinez," explained Cadet Captain Brian Foster, the senior cadet in charge of her unit. "I know you're tough and motivated, but there are physical realities we can't ignore. You're going to serve your country best by focusing on areas where you can excel: intelligence, logistics, communications. Leave the combat stuff to the guys who are built for it." The condescending tone made Sarah's blood boil, but she forced herself to remain respectful and professional. She knew that any display of anger or emotion would only reinforce the stereotype that women were too emotional and unstable for military service. Instead, she channeled her frustration into even more intense preparation and training. Every evening after mandatory study hours, Sarah would sneak out to the campus gym and work out until security kicked her out. She studied military history and tactics with the same intensity she had shown in high school, but now she had access to resources that had been unavailable to her before. Detailed case studies of military operations, leadership theories from respected officers, and technical manuals for weapon systems and equipment. Her roommate, Jennifer Walsh, was also in the Corps, but had a very different attitude toward the challenges they faced. Where Sarah saw obstacles to overcome, Jennifer saw reasons to lower expectations and accept limitations. "Why are you killing yourself like this?" Jennifer asked one night as Sarah returned from another late-night training session, covered in sweat and barely able to stand. "Nobody expects us to be as good as the guys. As long as we do okay and don't embarrass ourselves, we'll get our commissions and can serve in perfectly respectable support roles." "Because okay isn't good enough," Sarah replied, peeling off her sweat-soaked workout clothes. "If I'm going to wear the uniform, I'm going to earn the right to wear it. I'm not going to be anyone's token female officer." The conversation revealed a fundamental difference in their approaches to military service. Jennifer saw the Corps as a stepping stone to a stable career with good benefits and reasonable challenges. Sarah saw it as preparation for something much more demanding and dangerous, the kind of service that would push her to her absolute limits and beyond. This difference became more apparent as their freshman year progressed. During field training exercises, Sarah would volunteer for the most challenging assignments while Jennifer gravitated toward safer, easier tasks. When physical training became increasingly difficult, Sarah would push herself to exceed the minimum standards while Jennifer was content to meet the basic requirements. The divide wasn't limited to her roommate. Most of the other female cadets seemed to accept the limitations that were placed on them, viewing military service as a respectable career choice rather than a calling that demanded everything they had to give. Sarah found herself increasingly isolated, caught between male cadets who saw her as an intruder and female cadets who saw her as unnecessarily confrontational. The breaking point came during a particularly brutal field exercise in the piney woods of East Texas. The cadets were tasked with completing a 3-day survival and evasion course that tested their ability to navigate difficult terrain, find food and water, and evade capture by upperclassmen playing the role of enemy forces. Sarah had been looking forward to this exercise for months, seeing it as an opportunity to prove herself in an environment where physical strength mattered less than mental toughness and tactical thinking. But her enthusiasm was dampened when she discovered that the female cadets were being given a modified version of the course with easier objectives and shorter distances. "This is ridiculous," she complained to her squad leader, Cadet Sergeant First Class Mark Rodriguez. "We trained for the same course as everyone else. Why are we being given a watered-down version?" Rodriguez, who had grown to respect Sarah's determination over the course of the year, looked uncomfortable with the decision. "It's not my call, Martinez." The order came from higher up. Something about minimizing liability and ensuring success rates. The implication was clear. The leadership didn't believe the female cadets were capable of completing the full course and were taking steps to prevent embarrassing failures. For Sarah, this was the ultimate insult, suggesting that all her hard work and preparation was meaningless because of assumptions about her gender. That night, as the modified course began, Sarah made a decision that would have far-reaching consequences for her military career. Instead of following the route assigned to the female cadets, she broke away from her group and attempted to complete the full course alongside the male cadets. The terrain was brutal, dense forest, steep ravines, swampy areas filled with snakes and alligators, and mile after mile of challenging navigation that tested every skill she had developed. For 3 days, she pushed herself beyond any limits she had previously imagined, surviving on minimal food and water while evading capture teams that were specifically looking for cadets who might be trying to cheat or take shortcuts. Her body screamed in protest as she crawled through thorny underbrush, waded across cold streams, and climbed over fallen trees that blocked her path. Her feet were blistered, her hands were cut and bleeding, and exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her with every step. But she refused to quit or take the easier path that had been designated for her. On the final day of the exercise, as Sarah approached the extraction point that would mark the successful completion of the course, she was spotted by a team of upperclassmen who were serving as opposition forces. What followed was a grueling chase through rough terrain as she attempted to evade capture while suffering from severe dehydration and exhaustion. When she was finally caught, just a quarter mile from the extraction point, Sarah collapsed from exhaustion and had to be carried to the medical station. But even in her defeat, she had proven something important. She had lasted longer and traveled farther than many of the male cadets who had started the exercise in better physical condition. The aftermath of her unauthorized attempt to complete the full course was swift and severe. Sarah found herself standing at attention in front of the Corps Commandant, Colonel Patricia Hayes, facing potential expulsion from the program for violating direct orders and endangering herself unnecessarily. Colonel Hayes was a formidable woman who had fought hard to establish herself in the male-dominated world of military leadership. She had been one of the first female helicopter pilots in the Army and had served in combat zones where women were supposedly not allowed. Sarah had hoped that Hayes would understand her motivation and perhaps even approve of her initiative. Instead, she found herself facing the wrath of an officer who saw her actions as reckless and potentially damaging to the progress that women had made in military service. "Cadet Martinez," Colonel Hayes began, her voice cold and precise, "your actions during the field exercise were not only a violation of direct orders, but they were also incredibly selfish and short-sighted. Do you understand that?" Sarah stood at rigid attention, staring straight ahead as she replied, "No, ma'am, I do not understand." "Then let me explain it to you," Hayes continued. "Every woman in this program and every woman who has served before you has had to fight for the right to be taken seriously. We have had to prove ourselves over and over again, often exceeding the standards that men are held to, just to be accepted as competent officers. Your reckless behavior puts all of that progress at risk." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had expected criticism for violating orders, but she had never considered that her actions might be seen as harmful to other women in the military. "When you take unnecessary risks and put yourself in danger," Hayes continued, "you give ammunition to those who believe women don't belong in combat roles. When they have to send a medical team to rescue you because you couldn't complete a mission you weren't assigned to, it reinforces every stereotype about female weakness and poor judgment." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she fought to maintain her composure. She had never thought about her actions in those terms, had never considered that her individual choices might have broader implications for other women who shared her dreams of military service. "However," Colonel Hayes said, her tone softening slightly, "I also understand what motivated you to make those choices. I was young once too, and I felt that same burning need to prove myself against impossible odds. The question is whether you can learn to channel that motivation in ways that help, rather than hurt the cause you believe in." Over the following hour, Hayes explained the delicate balance that women in the military had to maintain. They couldn't afford to fail spectacularly, because their failures would be seen as evidence that all women were unfit for military service. But they also couldn't succeed by lowering standards or accepting limitations that men weren't expected to accept. "The key," Hayes explained, "is to excel within the opportunities you're given, while fighting to expand those opportunities for the women who will come after you. Change the system from within, don't break yourself against it from the outside." As punishment for her violation of orders, Sarah was placed on academic and military probation for the remainder of her freshman year. She was also assigned additional duties that kept her busy almost every hour she wasn't in class or studying. But instead of breaking her spirit, the punishment only strengthened her resolve to find better ways to prove herself. She began studying not just military tactics and strategy, but also the political and social forces that shaped military policy. She read everything she could find about women who had broken barriers in the armed forces, looking for patterns and strategies that might apply to her own situation. Most importantly, she began building relationships with like-minded cadets who shared her vision of military service. She found that there were other women in the program who wanted to push boundaries, and even some male cadets who believed that artificial limitations based on gender were counterproductive to military effectiveness. One of these allies was David Chen, a fellow freshman who had grown up in a military family and had been raised to believe that competence and character mattered more than gender or ethnicity. David had watched Sarah's unauthorized attempt to complete the field exercise with admiration rather than criticism. "You know what impressed me most about what you did?" he told her one evening as they studied together in the library. "It wasn't that you tried to complete the harder course. It was that you came so close to succeeding. If you had started with the same advantages as the rest of us, better nutrition, less stress, proper equipment, you probably would have made it." The observation gave Sarah a new perspective on her situation. She began to realize that the barriers she faced weren't necessarily insurmountable. They were just different from the challenges that others faced. If she could find ways to level the playing field or use her disadvantages as sources of strength, she might be able to achieve her goals through indirect means rather than direct confrontation. This new approach became evident during her sophomore year, when she was selected for a competitive internship with a military intelligence unit at a nearby Army base. The program was designed to give Corps cadets exposure to real-world military operations and help them make informed decisions about their career paths after graduation. Sarah threw herself into the internship with characteristic intensity, but this time she was more strategic about how she approached challenges. Instead of trying to outperform everyone else through sheer force of will, she focused on developing skills that were less dependent on physical attributes, analytical thinking, language skills, technological expertise, and leadership abilities that relied on intelligence and charisma rather than intimidation. The intelligence unit was a fascinating environment where the traditional military hierarchy was modified by the specialized knowledge and skills that different personnel brought to their missions. Sarah found herself working alongside seasoned NCOs who had decades of experience, civilian contractors with advanced technical degrees, and officers from various branches of the military who specialized in different aspects of intelligence gathering and analysis. For the first time since joining the Corps, Sarah felt like she was being judged primarily on her abilities rather than her gender. The intelligence community had always been more open to women than other military specialties, and her supervisors seemed genuinely interested in developing her potential rather than managing her limitations. Major Lisa Thompson, the officer in charge of the internship program, became an important mentor for Sarah. Thompson had served in intelligence roles during the First Gulf War and had been involved in some of the most sensitive operations of that conflict. She understood the challenges that women faced in military service, but she also recognized the unique advantages they could bring to certain missions. The best intelligence officers aren't necessarily the ones who can shoot the straightest or carry the heaviest pack, Thompson explained during one of their regular mentoring sessions. They're the ones who can think creatively, build trust with sources, analyze complex information, and make critical decisions under pressure. Those are skills that don't depend on gender. Under Thompson's guidance, Sarah began to see how her military career might unfold in ways she had never previously considered. She learned about special operations units that relied heavily on intelligence support, about covert missions where a woman's presence might be an advantage rather than a liability, and about the growing importance of technical intelligence capabilities in modern warfare. But perhaps most importantly, she learned that the path to serving in elite units might not require breaking down walls through direct confrontation. Instead, it might require building bridges and creating new models of military service that expanded opportunities for everyone while maintaining the high standards that made elite units effective. By the end of her sophomore year, Sarah had gained a reputation within the Corps as an exceptional cadet who excelled in academics, showed strong leadership potential, and demonstrated the kind of intellectual curiosity that military leaders valued. Her unauthorized field exercise was remembered more as a sign of exceptional motivation than reckless behavior, and she was being considered for advanced leadership positions within the Corps. the transformation wasn't just external. Internally, Sarah had developed a more sophisticated understanding of how change happened within large, tradition-bound organizations like the military. She still carried the same burning desire to serve in the most challenging and demanding roles possible, but now she had a better sense of how to navigate the political and social realities that would either support or hinder that goal. The tattoo on her shoulder remained a constant reminder of her ultimate objectives, but now it represented something more complex than simple defiance of limitations. It had become a symbol of her commitment to earning the right to serve alongside the nation's elite warriors, regardless of the path that journey might take. As she prepared for her junior year and began thinking seriously about her post-graduation plans, Sarah knew that the real test of her dedication was still ahead. The Corps of Cadets had been preparation for military service, but military service itself would present challenges that no amount of college training could fully prepare her for. The question was no longer whether she was tough enough or dedicated enough to pursue her dreams. The question was whether she was smart enough and adaptable enough to find ways to achieve those dreams within a system that was slowly changing but still resistant to revolutionary ideas about women's roles in combat. She was about to find out. Lieutenant Sarah Martinez stood on the tarmac at Kandahar Airfield, Afghanistan, watching the dust devils dance across the desert landscape in the early morning heat. It was March 2007, nearly 4 years since she had graduated from Texas A&M with a commission as a second lieutenant in the Army's Military Intelligence Corps. The journey that had brought her to this moment had been more challenging and circuitous than anything she could have imagined as an idealistic college student. After graduation, Sarah had been assigned to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, home to the 82nd Airborne Division and numerous special operations units. It was exactly where she had hoped to begin her military career, close enough to elite combat units to understand their operations and hopefully find opportunities to support their missions, even if she couldn't serve directly in their ranks. Her first assignment had been with the 525th Military Intelligence Brigade, where she worked as an intelligence analyst supporting operations across multiple theaters. It was demanding work that required her to process vast amounts of information from satellite imagery, intercepted communications, human intelligence reports, and countless other sources to create actionable intelligence for combat units. The work itself was fascinating and important, but Sarah quickly realized that being good at her assigned job wasn't enough to achieve her larger goals. The intelligence community was filled with brilliant analysts who could dissect complex information and produce insightful reports, but the analysts who got opportunities to work with special operations units were those who understood the operational environment firsthand. That understanding required deployment to combat zones, and deployment required navigating a complex web of regulations, policies, and informal barriers that made it difficult for women to serve in roles that put them close to actual combat operations. Sarah found herself caught in a bureaucratic catch-22. She needed combat experience to get assignments with elite units, but she couldn't get combat experience because policies prevented women from serving in combat roles. The situation was incredibly frustrating for someone who had spent years preparing herself for exactly these types of challenges. Sarah had maintained peak physical condition, continued studying military tactics and strategy, and had earned advanced certifications in multiple intelligence specialties. On paper, she was as qualified as any officer in her peer group, but on deployment rosters, she was consistently assigned to rear area positions that kept her away from the most demanding and dangerous missions. The breakthrough came during her second year at Fort Bragg, when personnel shortages and the urgent demands of ongoing operations in Iraq and Afghanistan began to override some of the traditional restrictions on women's roles. Sarah volunteered for every deployment opportunity that became available, regardless of the location or conditions, and eventually found herself selected for a position supporting Special Operations Forces in Afghanistan. The assignment was supposed to be a 6-month deployment working at the Intelligence Fusion Center at Bagram Airfield, safely behind multiple layers of security and well removed from any direct combat operations. But Afghanistan in 2007 was a chaotic environment where the lines between combat and support roles were constantly blurring, and Sarah quickly found herself involved in operations that went far beyond anything she had trained for in her intelligence courses. Her first real taste of combat came just 3 weeks into her deployment. She had been working the night shift at the intelligence center when a special operations team, conducting a high-value target raid, requested immediate analytical support to identify the layout of a compound they were approaching.
I said to myself,
the usual process would have involved submitting the request through multiple levels of command and waiting for a response from higher headquarters, but the tactical situation was evolving too quickly for normal procedures. Sarah made a split-second decision that would change the course of her career. Using real-time satellite imagery and communications intercepts, she began providing direct support to the team over their radio network, walking them through the compound layout, identifying potential threats, and helping them adapt their approach based on new intelligence that was coming in from multiple sources. The operation was a complete success, with the target captured and no casualties among the assault team. But Sarah's unauthorized direct support to a combat operation had violated numerous policies and regulations governing how intelligence personnel were supposed to interact with special operations units. The aftermath was similar to her unauthorized field exercise during college, but with much higher stakes. Sarah found herself standing before Colonel Marcus Webb, the commander of the Special Operations Task Force, facing potential disciplinary action for exceeding her authority and operating outside established procedures. But this time, the response was very different from what she had experienced as a cadet.
Lieutenant Martinez, Colonel Webb began. What you did last night was technically a violation of several policies regarding intelligence support to combat operations. Do you understand that?
Yes, sir, Sarah replied, maintaining her military bearing despite the knot of anxiety in her stomach. Good, Webb continued, surprising her with a slight smile. Because I want you to understand exactly which policies you violated so you can figure out how to violate them more effectively in the future. The colonel went on to explain that the rigid procedures governing intelligence support were often inadequate for the fast-moving operations that special forces conducted. What Sarah had done, providing real-time analytical support directly to the team conducting the operation, was exactly what they needed, but the bureaucratic structure of the intelligence community made it nearly impossible to provide that kind of support through official channels. The team leader specifically asked me to commend your work, Webb told her. He said your analysis prevented them from walking into an ambush and probably saved several lives. That's the kind of intelligence support that wins wars, not the sanitized reports that take 3 days to produce and are obsolete before they reach the field. Over the following months, Sarah found herself increasingly involved in special operations missions, always in an intelligence support role but often working much closer to actual combat than regulations technically allowed. She accompanied teams to forward operating bases just miles from enemy positions, provided on-scene intelligence analysis during complex operations, and even participated in some missions where her presence was essential for gathering or interpreting intelligence that male soldiers couldn't access. The work was everything she had dreamed about, and more challenging than anything she had ever experienced. She was finally serving alongside the elite warriors she had always admired, contributing to missions that had strategic importance, and proving herself in an environment where competence and courage were the only things that mattered. But the physical and emotional toll was enormous. The constant stress of operating in a combat environment, the irregular sleep schedule, the weight of knowing that her analysis could mean the difference between life and death for the soldiers she supported, all of it combined to push her to her absolute limits. The breaking point came during her 5th month in Afghanistan, during an operation that would test everything she believed about herself and her commitment to military service. Intelligence reports had identified a high-value target hiding in a remote valley in eastern Afghanistan, near the Pakistani border. The target was believed to be a key facilitator for foreign fighters entering Afghanistan, and his capture was considered critical to disrupting enemy operations in the region. The mission required a complex, multi-phase operation involving helicopter insertions, ground movement through difficult terrain, and coordination with local Afghan forces. Sarah was assigned to provide intelligence support from a forward command post that would be established on a ridge overlooking the target area. Everything that could go wrong did go wrong. The weather turned bad shortly after the operation began, grounding the helicopters that were supposed to provide air support and extraction capability. Communications equipment malfunctioned, leaving the assault teams partially cut off from higher command, and the intelligence on enemy strength in the area proved to be dramatically understated. What was supposed to be a quick raid to capture a single high-value target turned into a running firefight involving dozens of enemy fighters who seemed to appear from every direction. The forward command post where Sarah was stationed came under direct attack, and she found herself fighting for her life alongside a handful of special operations soldiers who were vastly outnumbered and completely cut off from reinforcement. For 6 hours, Sarah experienced combat in its most raw and brutal form. She fired her weapon in anger for the first time, seeing enemy fighters fall to her shots. She applied first aid to wounded soldiers while bullets whined overhead. She helped carry injured men to better positions while under heavy fire, and she continued to provide intelligence analysis and coordination support, even as the command post was repeatedly attacked by enemy forces. The most intense moment came when enemy fighters managed to get close enough to throw grenades into the command post. Sarah was knocked unconscious by the explosion and woke up to find herself partially buried under rubble, with blood running down her face and her left arm hanging uselessly at her side. Despite her injuries, she managed to crawl to a radio and re-establish communications with the assault teams, providing critical information about enemy positions that allowed them to coordinate a counterattack that finally broke the enemy assault. When rescue helicopters finally arrived hours later, they found Sarah still at her post, semi-conscious from blood loss but continuing to provide intelligence support to the team still engaged with enemy forces. The aftermath of the operation was traumatic in ways that went beyond the physical injuries. 3 soldiers had been killed and 7 others wounded, including Sarah herself. The high-value target had escaped in the confusion, making the entire mission appear to be a failure, despite the tactical success in defeating a much larger enemy force. But for Sarah, the most difficult aspect of the aftermath was the realization of how the operation would be reported and remembered. Despite her actions during the firefight, despite providing critical intelligence support while wounded and under fire, despite literally fighting for her life alongside elite special operations soldiers, her role in the operation would be minimized in official reports because acknowledging it would require admitting that a woman had participated in direct combat operations. The psychological impact of this realization was devastating. Sarah had spent her entire adult life preparing for exactly this type of situation, had proven herself capable of performing under the most extreme conditions imaginable, and had saved lives through her actions and decisions. But instead of being recognized as a warrior who had earned her place among the nation's elite fighters, she would be remembered as an intelligence analyst who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The physical recovery from her injuries took months. Her left shoulder had been damaged by shrapnel and required multiple surgeries to repair. The concussion from the grenade blast left her with persistent headaches and memory issues that made it difficult to concentrate on complex analytical tasks. And the psychological trauma of the experience left her struggling with nightmares and anxiety that she tried desperately to hide from her supervisors and colleagues. But the emotional recovery was even more challenging. Sarah had to come to terms with the fact that the system she had devoted her life to serving was fundamentally incapable of recognizing or rewarding the kind of contribution she was capable of making. No matter how much she accomplished, no matter how much she sacrificed, no matter how clearly she proved her worth in combat, she would always be seen as an exception rather than an example. During her medical leave, Sarah found herself questioning everything she had believed about her military career and her future prospects. The tattoo that had once represented her aspirations now seemed like a cruel joke, a permanent reminder of dreams that the system would never allow her to fully achieve. She considered leaving the military entirely and pursuing a civilian career where her intelligence background and combat experience might be valued without the artificial limitations imposed by gender-based policies. She had job offers from defense contractors and intelligence agencies that would have provided better pay, more interesting work, and greater opportunities for advancement than anything she was likely to find in the military. But ultimately, Sarah realized that walking away would be a betrayal of everything her grandfather had taught her about service and sacrifice. More importantly, it would be a betrayal of the other women who would follow in her footsteps and who might benefit from the precedents she could establish if she continued fighting for change from within the system. The decision to remain in the military came during a visit from Colonel Webb, who had traveled to Walter Reed Medical Center where Sarah was receiving treatment for her injuries. Webb had been following her recovery closely and had been working behind the scenes to ensure that her contributions to special operations missions were properly documented, even if they couldn't be publicly recognized. "I want you to know Webb told her during their meeting that what you did over there matters. Not just the intelligence work, though, that was exceptional, but the way you conducted yourself under fire, the way you kept functioning when everything went to hell. That's the kind of performance that changes minds and opens doors. He went on to explain that attitudes within the special operations community were slowly changing as leaders recognized the valuable contributions that women could make to their missions. The rigid policies that prevented women from serving in combat roles were beginning to be seen as outdated obstacles to military effectiveness rather than necessary protections. Change is coming, Webb assured her. It's going to take time and it's going to require people like you to keep pushing the boundaries and proving what's possible. But it's coming. As Sarah returned to active duty and began planning the next phase of her career, she carried with her a new understanding of her role in the military transformation that was slowly taking place. She was no longer just trying to prove herself worthy of opportunities that already existed. She was helping to create new opportunities for the women who would serve after her. The tattoo on her shoulder had evolved in meaning once again. It was no longer just a statement of personal aspiration or a symbol of defiance against artificial limitations. It had become a promise to the future, a commitment to continue fighting for the changes that would eventually allow women to serve in any role where they could contribute to their country's defense. The path forward would not be easy, and there would be many more challenges and setbacks ahead. But Sarah now understood that her individual journey was part of a larger transformation that would ultimately benefit everyone who wore the uniform, regardless of their gender. She was ready for whatever came next. 10 years had passed since that devastating firefight in Afghanistan, and Major Sarah Martinez found herself standing in the Pentagon, preparing for a meeting that would change not only her own career trajectory, but potentially the future of women in special operations. The year was 2017, and the military was undergoing the most significant transformation in gender policies since women had first been allowed to serve. The journey to this moment had been marked by incremental progress, punctuated by frustrating setbacks. After her recovery from the injuries sustained in Afghanistan, Sarah had been assigned to a series of increasingly responsible positions within the intelligence community, each one building on her reputation as an innovative analyst with unique insights into special operations. She had served at the National Security Agency, where she developed new methodologies for analyzing terrorist communications networks. She had completed a master's degree in international relations at Georgetown University while working at the Pentagon's Joint Staff. She had deployed twice more to Iraq and once to Syria, each time in roles that pushed the boundaries of traditional intelligence support while carefully staying within the evolving legal framework governing women's participation in combat operations. Throughout this period, Sarah had watched with mixed emotions as the military slowly began to acknowledge the contributions that women could make to combat operations. In 2013, the Department of Defense had officially lifted the ban on women serving in combat roles, opening thousands of positions that had previously been closed to female service members. But the implementation of this policy change was gradual and uneven, with each service and each unit interpreting the new rules differently. The special operations community had been particularly resistant to change, arguing that their unique mission requirements and extremely high standards made them unsuitable for integration. This resistance wasn't necessarily based on gender bias, though that certainly existed in some quarters, but rather on legitimate concerns about unit cohesion, physical requirements, and the potential impact of policy changes on operational effectiveness. Sarah understood these concerns better than most, having worked closely with special operations units for over a decade. She knew that these were men who depended on each other for survival in the most dangerous situations imaginable, and that trust and teamwork were literally matters of life and death. She also knew that any woman who wanted to serve in these units would need to meet exactly the same standards as their male counterparts, with no accommodations or lowered expectations. But she also knew, from her own experience and from working with exceptional female soldiers throughout her career, that there were women who could meet those standards and who could make valuable contributions to special operations missions. The meeting she was about to attend had been arranged by General Patricia Harrison, who had recently been appointed as the first woman to serve as commander of Special Operations Command. Harrison's appointment had been controversial within the special operations community, with some questioning whether someone without direct special operations experience could effectively lead such specialized units. But Harrison had earned her position through decades of distinguished service in conventional forces and joint operations, and she had made it clear that her priority was improving the overall effectiveness of special operations, rather than advancing any particular agenda regarding gender integration. "Major Martinez," General Harrison began as Sarah entered her office, "thank you for coming. I've been reviewing your file, and I have to say, your record is quite impressive. Colonel Webb speaks very highly of your work in Afghanistan, and your subsequent assignments have shown remarkable breadth and depth of experience." But Sarah remained at attention until Harrison gestured for her to sit. The general's office was smaller than Sarah had expected, with maps of various conflict zones covering the walls and stacks of classified briefings covering most surfaces. It was clearly the workspace of someone who was deeply engaged in operational details rather than just administrative oversight. "Ma'am, I appreciate the opportunity to meet with you," Sarah replied. "I understand you're working on some important policy initiatives." Harrison smiled slightly. "That's one way to put it. What I'm working on is figuring out how to make special operations more effective while also complying with new policies regarding gender integration. It's a complex challenge that requires input from people who understand both the operational requirements and the broader policy implications." Over the next hour, Harrison outlined her vision for the future of special operations. Rather than simply allowing women to compete for existing positions, which had been the approach taken by most conventional units, she was proposing a more comprehensive re-evaluation of how special operations missions were conducted and how teams were organized. "The nature of conflict has changed dramatically over the past decade," Harrison explained. "We're not just kicking down doors and engaging in direct firefights anymore. Modern special operations require a much broader range of skills: linguistic capabilities, cultural understanding, technical expertise, intelligence analysis, and the ability to work with civilian populations." She went on to describe specific missions where women had already proven their value to special operations, often in unofficial capacities. Female intelligence officers had provided critical support during sensitive operations. Female soldiers had conducted liaison work with local women in conservative societies where male soldiers couldn't effectively operate. Female pilots had flown special operations aircraft in combat zones. Female medics had treated wounded special operations soldiers under fire. "The question isn't whether women can contribute to special operations," Harrison continued. "The question is how to formally recognize and integrate the contributions they're already making while maintaining the standards and unit cohesion that make these units effective." Sarah found herself nodding as Harrison spoke. This was exactly the kind of thoughtful, comprehensive approach that she had hoped to see from military leadership. Rather than either blindly resisting change or implementing it without regard for operational consequences, Harrison was proposing a careful, deliberate process that would serve both policy objectives and operational effectiveness. "What I need from you," Harrison said, fixing Sarah with an intense stare, "is your honest assessment of what it would take to successfully integrate qualified women into special operations units. Not what politicians want to hear, not what advocacy groups want to hear, but the truth based on your experience working with these units and understanding their mission requirements." The conversation that followed was unlike any Sarah had experienced in her military career. Instead of tiptoeing around sensitive topics or trying to give politically acceptable answers, she found herself engaged in a frank discussion about the real challenges and opportunities associated with gender integration in special operations. She talked about the physical requirements and how they might be modified without compromising operational effectiveness. She discussed the cultural barriers within the special operations community and how they might be addressed through leadership and education. She analyzed the potential impact on unit cohesion and suggested strategies for maintaining team effectiveness while introducing new personnel. Most importantly, she shared her own experiences and observations from years of working alongside special operations personnel in combat environments. She described situations where her presence had been an operational advantage, others where it had created complications, and many where gender had been completely irrelevant to mission success. The bottom line, Sarah concluded, is that special operations units need the best possible people, regardless of their gender. But integrating women successfully will require careful selection, thorough preparation, and strong leadership commitment to maintaining standards while managing the inevitable challenges that will arise. Harrison nodded thoughtfully. That assessment aligns with my own thinking. Which brings me to the real reason I wanted to meet with you. I'm assembling a team to develop and implement integration policies for special operations. I need people who understand both the operational environment and the policy implications, who have the credibility to work with existing special operations personnel, and who have the vision to help create something that doesn't currently exist. The offer that followed was everything Sarah had ever hoped for, and more than she had ever dared to expect. Harrison was proposing to assign her to a new joint task force that would be responsible for developing integration standards, training programs, and assessment protocols for women seeking to serve in special operations roles. The position would involve working directly with existing special operations units to understand their specific requirements and challenges. It would require developing new selection and training programs that would ensure only the most qualified candidates were considered for special operations roles. And it would involve serving as a liaison between the special operations community and higher military leadership, as integration policies were developed and implemented. I won't lie to you, Harrison said as she outlined the assignment. This is going to be one of the most challenging jobs in the military. You'll be working with people who are skeptical of change, implementing policies that don't yet exist, and trying to maintain operational effectiveness while managing a major organizational transformation. She paused and looked directly at Sarah. You'll also be under intense scrutiny from both supporters and critics of integration. Every decision you make, every recommendation you offer, will be analyzed and criticized by people who have strong opinions about women in combat roles. Some will see you as a traitor to your gender if you support maintaining high standards. Others will see you as a radical feminist if you advocate for any changes to existing procedures. The warning was sobering but not surprising. Sarah had already experienced some of this scrutiny throughout her career, as people had tried to categorize her motivations and objectives based on their own preconceptions about women in the military. "Ma'am," Sarah replied after considering the offer carefully, "I understand the challenges and the risks. But this is exactly the kind of work I've been preparing for my entire career. If there's an opportunity to help create a system that evaluates people based on their abilities rather than their gender, then I want to be part of that effort." Harrison smiled for the first time during their meeting. "I was hoping you would say that. Your first assignment will be to conduct a comprehensive assessment of the Navy SEAL training program at Naval Special Warfare Command in Coronado, California. The Navy has been the most resistant to integration among the services, and SEAL training is considered the gold standard for special operations selection and preparation. The assignment would require Sarah to spend 6 months embedded with Navy SEAL instructors and candidates, observing every aspect of the training program, and developing recommendations for how it might be modified to accommodate qualified women while maintaining its legendary standards. This isn't about lowering standards or making accommodations, Harrison emphasized. This is about understanding whether the current standards accurately reflect mission requirements and whether there are ways to evaluate candidates that might identify qualified women who could contribute to SEAL operations. As Sarah prepared to leave Harrison's office, the general made one final comment that would stay with her throughout the challenges ahead. "Major Martinez, you should know that there are people throughout the special operations community who are watching your work very carefully. Some of them are hoping you'll fail because that would confirm their belief that women don't belong in special operations. Others are hoping you'll succeed because they believe the community needs to evolve to remain effective." She paused and fixed Sarah with another intense stare. "But there's a third group that doesn't care whether you succeed or fail. They only care whether your work makes special operations more effective. Those are the people whose opinions matter most, and those are the people you need to focus on impressing." 6 weeks later, Sarah found herself standing on the beach at Naval Special Warfare Command in Coronado, watching a new class of SEAL candidates begin their journey through what was widely considered the most demanding military training program in the world. She had spent the intervening weeks studying every aspect of SEAL selection and training, interviewing instructors and former students, and developing a comprehensive understanding of what made the program effective. Now she was about to begin the most important assignment of her career, one that would determine not only her own future, but potentially the future of women in special operations throughout the entire military. The tattoo on her shoulder, hidden beneath her military uniform, had taken on new significance as she prepared for this challenge. What had begun as a symbol of youthful defiance had evolved into a representation of her journey through the military system. Now it would serve as a reminder of the responsibility she carried, not just to prove her own worth, but to help create opportunities for other qualified women to serve their country in the most demanding roles possible. As she watched the SEAL candidates struggling through their first day of training, Sarah reflected on how far she had come from that small Texas town where everyone had laughed at her impossible dreams. The journey had been longer and more complex than anything she could have imagined as an 18-year-old, with more determination than wisdom. But now, finally, she was in a position to help make those impossible dreams possible for others who shared her commitment to excellence and service. The real work was just beginning. 3 years had passed since Major Sarah Martinez had begun her assignment at Naval Special Warfare Command, and the transformation had been more dramatic than anyone could have predicted. It was now 2020, and Sarah had been promoted to Lieutenant Colonel, serving as the senior military advisor for Special Operations Integration Policy across all branches of the armed forces. The work had been exhausting, controversial, and occasionally dangerous. Sarah had faced death threats from extremists who opposed women in combat roles, character assassination from critics who questioned her motivations, and constant pressure from media outlets seeking sensational stories about her efforts to feminize elite military units. But she had also experienced moments of profound satisfaction as barriers fell and new opportunities opened for qualified women throughout the special operations community. The careful, methodical approach she had advocated for had proven successful beyond even her own expectations. The key breakthrough had come during her second year at Coronado, when she had identified a fundamental flaw in how SEAL training evaluated certain critical skills. The traditional approach had emphasized raw physical strength and endurance in ways that, while important, didn't necessarily correlate with operational effectiveness in modern special operations missions. Working with senior SEAL instructors who were willing to consider new approaches, Sarah had helped develop additional assessment criteria that evaluated candidates' problem-solving abilities under stress, their capacity for strategic thinking during chaotic situations, their cultural sensitivity and language skills, and their ability to build trust and rapport with diverse populations. These new evaluation criteria didn't lower standards, if anything. They made the selection process more comprehensive and demanding. But they also identified qualified candidates who might have been overlooked under the previous system, including several women who had successfully completed the modified training program and were now serving with SEAL teams in operational roles. The success of these pilot programs had led to similar initiatives throughout the special operations community. Army Special Forces, Air Force Pararescue, Marine Special Operations, and other elite units had implemented comparable assessment and training programs that evaluated candidates based on their potential contribution to mission success rather than their conformity to traditional physical stereotypes. But perhaps the most significant change had been cultural rather than procedural, as qualified women had proven themselves in special operations roles, and as their contributions had become undeniable. The resistance within the community had largely evaporated. The focus had shifted from whether women belonged in special operations to how to identify and develop the best candidates regardless of their gender. This cultural transformation was evident during the ceremony that was taking place on a warm Tuesday morning in September 2020. Sarah stood in formation with her colleagues as they participated in the change of command ceremony for Naval Special Warfare Command, where Rear Admiral Jennifer Hayes, the first woman to command a major special operations unit, was assuming leadership of the organization. The ceremony was taking place at the Naval Special Warfare Compound in Coronado, with an audience that included senior military leaders, government officials, and distinguished guests from throughout the special operations community. For Sarah, it represented the culmination of decades of work to create opportunities for women to serve in the most demanding military roles. But the moment that would define the entire ceremony, and that would become a symbol of how far the military had evolved, occurred during the presentation of awards and recognitions that followed the change of command. Admiral Hayes had chosen to use the ceremony to recognize outstanding contributions to special operations over the previous year, and Sarah had been selected to receive the Joint Special Operations Command Medal of Excellence for her work in developing integration policies and training programs. As Sarah stepped forward to receive the award, she noticed a familiar figure in the audience. Commander Marcus Thompson, the senior enlisted SEAL who had been one of her most vocal critics during her early days at Coronado, was watching the ceremony with an expression of respectful attention. Thompson had been skeptical of Sarah's assignment from the beginning, questioning whether someone who had never completed SEAL training could understand the unique requirements and challenges of special operations. He had been particularly critical of her proposals to modify assessment criteria, arguing that any changes to proven methods would inevitably lead to lower standards and reduced effectiveness. But over the 3 years of working together, Thompson had become one of Sarah's strongest supporters as he witnessed the positive impact of the changes she had helped implement. The women who had successfully completed the modified training program had proven themselves to be exceptional operators, and the new assessment criteria had actually improved the overall quality of SEAL candidates by identifying individuals with diverse skill sets that enhanced team effectiveness. As Admiral Hayes read the citation accompanying Sarah's medal, she highlighted the specific contributions that had made the integration program successful. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez has demonstrated exceptional leadership, innovation, and dedication in developing and implementing policies that have strengthened special operations capabilities while expanding opportunities for all qualified service members. Her work has resulted in the successful integration of 37 women into special operations roles across all services, with a retention rate and performance evaluation scores that exceed the average for their male counterparts. The citation went on to describe specific operations where women trained under Sarah's programs had made critical contributions to mission success, including counter-terrorism operations in Africa, humanitarian assistance missions in Asia, and intelligence gathering operations in the Middle East. But the most powerful moment came when Admiral Hayes presented the actual medal to Sarah. As she pinned the decoration to Sarah's uniform, her hand briefly touched the fabric covering Sarah's shoulder, where the SEAL Trident tattoo remained hidden beneath her military blouse. "I understand you have something under there that's been with you for quite a while," Hayes said quietly, her voice barely audible to anyone beyond Sarah. Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak as emotions threatened to overwhelm her professional composure. "I think it's time for that tattoo to come out of hiding," Hayes continued. "Would you mind removing your blouse?" The request was unprecedented in a formal military ceremony, but Sarah understood its significance immediately. After nearly 2 decades of keeping her tattoo hidden because it represented aspirations that the military system couldn't officially acknowledge, she was being invited to reveal it in front of the entire special operations community. With hands that trembled slightly from emotion rather than nervousness, Sarah unbuttoned her military blouse and removed it, revealing the elaborate SEAL Trident tattoo that covered her left shoulder. The artwork had faded somewhat over the years, but the details were still clearly visible. The golden eagle, the anchor, the trident, and the flintlock pistol that represented everything she had worked toward achieving. A murmur went through the assembled crowd as people realized the significance of what they were seeing. This wasn't just a tattoo, it was a 20-year-old declaration of intent from a small-town girl who had refused to accept limitations on her potential. What happened next would become legendary within the special operations community. Commander Thompson, the senior enlisted SEAL who had been Sarah's harshest critic and most surprising ally, stepped forward from the formation and rendered a crisp military salute directly to Sarah and her tattoo. The salute was followed by another, then another, as every SEAL in attendance followed Thompson's lead. Within moments, the entire formation of special operations personnel was saluting the woman who had helped transform their community while maintaining the standards that made them effective. The salute lasted for several minutes, during which Sarah stood at attention with tears streaming down her face. This wasn't just recognition of her individual accomplishments. It was acknowledgement from the special operations community that she had earned her place among them, that her contributions had made them stronger, and that the tattoo she had carried for so long was no longer a symbol of impossible dreams, but a representation of achievements that had seemed impossible to others. Admiral Hayes allowed the moment to continue for as long as the formation maintained their salutes, understanding that this spontaneous gesture was more meaningful than any formal award or recognition that could be presented. When the salutes finally ended, she addressed the assembled group with words that would be remembered long after the ceremony concluded. "What we have witnessed today represents the best of military tradition and the promise of military evolution. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez has spent her career proving that excellence knows no gender, that determination can overcome any obstacle, and that the strength of our special operations community comes not from exclusion, but from inclusion of the best candidates regardless of their background. She paused and looked directly at Sarah before continuing. That tattoo represents more than personal aspiration. It represents a commitment to the values and standards that define special operations. Today, we recognize that commitment has been fulfilled not just through individual achievement, but through service that has made all of us better at what we do. The ceremony concluded with Sarah being presented with an additional recognition that had never been awarded to anyone before, an honorary SEAL Trident pin. Acknowledging her contributions to the special operations community, even though she had never formally completed SEAL training herself. As the formation dispersed and the ceremony ended, Sarah found herself surrounded by colleagues and friends who wanted to congratulate her on the recognition. But the moment that meant the most came when Commander Thompson approached her privately after the official proceedings had concluded. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying a respect that had been earned through years of working together. "I owe you an apology. When you first arrived here, I thought you were trying to change something that didn't need changing. I thought you were going to make us weaker by forcing us to accept lower standards." He looked at the tattoo that was still visible on her shoulder and shook his head with something that might have been amazement. "I was wrong about everything except one thing," he continued. "You really do belong here. Not because anyone gave you special treatment or made accommodations for you, but because you earned it the same way we all did. Through sacrifice, dedication, and refusing to quit when everything seemed impossible." The conversation that followed was one of the most meaningful of Sarah's entire career. Thompson shared stories about how the women who had completed the modified training program had performed in operational environments, describing specific situations where their unique skills and perspectives had made critical differences in mission outcomes. He also talked about how the integration process had affected the male members of special operations units, many of whom had initially been skeptical but had come to see diversity as a source of strength rather than a complication to be managed. "The teams are better now," Thompson concluded. "Not because we lowered standards, but because we raised them in ways that matter for modern operations. The women who made it through aren't just good operators, they're exceptional operators who bring capabilities that we didn't even know we needed." As Sarah drove home that evening, still wearing the honorary SEAL Trident pin on her uniform, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The small-town girl who had been mocked for getting a tattoo representing impossible dreams had not only achieved those dreams, but had helped create a system where others could achieve them as well. The tattoo that had once been a source of ridicule had become a symbol of transformation, not just her own transformation, but the transformation of an entire military community that had learned to value excellence over conformity, capability over tradition, and results over assumptions. But perhaps most importantly, the ceremony had demonstrated that real change in large organizations didn't come through confrontation or demands for special treatment. It came through sustained excellence, patient persistence, and the willingness to prove worth through performance rather than politics. As she reached her home and prepared to remove the uniform that bore her new decorations, Sarah paused to look at the tattoo that had started it all. The ink had faded and the lines had blurred slightly over 20 years, but the meaning had only grown stronger. Tomorrow, she would begin work on her next assignment, developing integration policies for other elite units throughout the Department of Defense. There would be new challenges, new skeptics to convince, and new barriers to overcome. But tonight, for the first time in her adult life, Sarah Martinez felt that she had truly arrived at the destination she had been seeking since she was 18 years old. She had earned the salute of the warriors she had always admired, had proven that her dreams were not impossible after all, and had opened doors for others who shared her determination to serve their country without limitations. The journey had taken longer than she had expected, and had required more sacrifice than she had anticipated. But as she stood in her living room, still wearing the uniform of a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army, with an honorary SEAL Trident pin on her chest, Sarah knew that every moment of doubt, every obstacle overcome, and every small victory along the way had been worth it. She had kept faith with the promise she had made to her grandfather's memory all those years ago. She had served her country with honor, courage, and distinction. And she had proven that the only limits on human potential are those we accept in our own minds. The girl who had been laughed at for her tattoo had become the woman who changed history. And the SEAL commander had saluted not just her achievements, but the dreams of everyone who refuses to accept that anything truly worthwhile is impossible to achieve.